Welcome to this latest installment in Fathom series, Those Who Tried, Conversations with the Peace Processors. I'm Fathom co-editor Jack Jackman. With me is my fellow co-editor Caleb Ben-Dor, and we're delighted today to be joined by Dr. Tal Becker. Tal is a vice president of the Shalom Hartman Institute, where he leads educational initiatives on Israel and the Jewish world. He served until recently as the legal advisor of the Israeli Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and has been a senior member of the Israeli peace negotiation team in successive rounds of peace negotiations. He also played an instrumental role in negotiating and drafting the Abraham Accords between Israel and the UAE, Bahrain, and Morocco. Welcome, Tal.
Good to be with you.
We're speaking at a time when tragically Israeli-Palestinian peace seems a distant prospect. We'll get to the present later, but I want to start in general terms and consider what we've learned from previous efforts. You've written in the past that we're often too preoccupied with a peace agreement itself, seeing it as an end rather than a means to an end. Could you expand on that for us?
Yeah, I think it really starts with a question about how do you conceive of peace? What is peace, right? And I think there are many people who they think peace is that magical signing ceremony and so on. The instruments around it, the document we draft. But essentially, peace is a shift in consciousness. The way I understand it is that peoples who see each other in a certain way, they think they're in an adversarial relationship. They might even think they're in a zero-sum relationship, create a reality and a narrative and a mindset that enables them to understand themselves and each other in a different relationship, right? So what you're trying to do in a peace agreement or in any peace process is create the conditions for a different consciousness to emerge, right? I'll tell you the way I think about this. When we were involved in the Annapolis process, I asked my staff at the time to prepare a compendium of every peace agreement that had been reached around the world in the last 50 years. And I spent 2 days just reading peace agreements. Kind of a rare thing to do because Israelis and Palestinians are very proud of the idea that we have nothing to learn from anybody else most of the time. And I just thought, let me see if I can get inspiration. And what happens when you read peace agreements is that you realize that they're really boring documents. They're very technical. We'll redeploy troops here, we'll draw a boundary here. Sometimes there's some flowery language, usually in the speeches and so on. But there isn't that kind of what you might expect, this kind of transcendent idea that we're moving into a new reality, very technical. And I think there's a big insight in there. And that is that peace agreements are not really about bringing peace. They are an investment or a gamble in the idea that if you shift reality, if you shift the reality on the ground, you will cultivate a different consciousness in the people over time. And the engineers of peace are the children, the educators, the business leaders who emerge in the new reality that agreement created. And that creates space for new narratives. So what matters at the end is whether the agreement created a reality that enabled that shift in consciousness and identity stories, not the actual document itself. That's what I mean by that. And maybe just to add, I'm sorry, Caleb, I'll just add that, and sometimes that can be achieved without an agreement at all, right? You could shift the reality and enable a different consciousness to emerge without the negotiators and without the ceremonies. And that may be just as valid.
So I actually didn't plan on asking this, but just a very small tangent. So I've been involved in one particular Israeli-Palestinian thing, and they take people to Northern Ireland. So you go to Northern Ireland, and we were, firstly, crazily, you see Israeli-Palestinian flags because they projected their conflict onto us, but that's a separate issue. And I remember we heard the Catholics, and they said, we signed the Good Friday Agreement, and by signing it, we guaranteed that Ireland will one day be completely independent. Northern Ireland will be part of the Republic of Ireland. And very interesting. Then we had the Protestants, and they said, we signed the Good Friday Agreement. We guaranteed Northern Ireland is going to be part of the United Kingdom forever. So we're sitting there. Something doesn't quite add up. And you go there, and we thought, this is peace? This is this kind of utopian idea that we've been told about on Northern Ireland. And you realize actually that's you need to reframe your idea of what peace is in a way that I think is actually quite similar to what you just said, that the Good Friday Agreement creates space for a new generation of, firstly, it rejects violence, and then it creates space for a new generation to have a better life, rather than this, you've used the word in other cases, utopian, but this utopian reconciliation of historical claims and grievances.
Yeah. So, I mean, Jack described me as a part of the peace processors. Like, I don't know whether that's such a distinguished group considered at the moment, but I sometimes ask myself why I lasted so long in that process. And I think it's because I've never had a conception of peace in utopian terms. I think about peace in the way that I think about security. We never think about security as being ultimate and hermetic and bringing a messianic age. There's more security or there's less security. And in the same way, there's more peace or there's less peace. Even a peace agreement, even if you have all the fancy signings, there's still going to be problems. You know, I'm someone who doesn't like using the word solution in foreign policy because I don't think countries have solutions. They're not math problems. What you're trying to do is have more prosperity, more peace for more people, more of the time, right? And then the negotiating effort, the agreement is just one component of a much broader attempt to create that space that you're mentioning, Kalev. Sometimes you need to use that kind of what we call in the business constructive ambiguity that enables each side to read into the agreement a narrative that they had in the way that you described in the Northern Ireland context. Sometimes that ambiguity can be destructive, and you actually need to be clear that you're jettisoning some vision or some dream. It's not always that kind of way to read multiple narratives into a paragraph is a good idea. That can actually sow the seeds of subsequent problems. But broadly, yes, that is how I think about it. I think that a lot of damage has been done by people who are too ideological and too utopian. And I think even of a peace agreement itself as just yet another building block in creating the space for stories of coexistence to get legitimacy within each society.
So you've written about some common misconceptions of Israeli-Palestinian negotiations, and I think what's interesting, it was over a decade ago, but actually they're still, we think, very instructive. So we just like to run through some of them, and just for you to comment on
Sure.
kind of what you meant. So one is, and interestingly, so we've been speaking to a number of peace processes in inverted commas, and two others have also mentioned this. So one common misconception is we've been negotiating for 20 or 30 years. Nothing's been achieved. Just get to the damn table. If only, as in there's just one missing element, and then we'll be there. And perhaps the most famous one, everyone knows what an agreement looks like. Could you comment on some of those and what you meant, please, Tal?
Well, I mean, I wrote that piece a long time ago, so not only do I not remember what I wrote, but I also not sure that I'm kind of committed to anything I wrote there. But when you read them out, it still kind of resonates. So I'll touch on a few of them. I mean, I think first of all, it's worth noting that from a broad perspective, there've only been really three significant efforts to address the core issues of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict at the track one level, at the official level, in the context of the Camp David-Taba process, in the context of the Annapolis process, and what's called the Kerry talks and the London talks in 2014. There have been other efforts to some extent, but broadly over that, basically almost 30-year period, that's not a lot of time devoted, and I think I said in that paper that, we've spent more time arguing about why we're not negotiating than we have about actually negotiating. And I think there's good news and bad news in that. The bad news is we wasted a lot of time, and we really, to understand the issues, not at the level of slogan, but deeply, is a real effort. And there are, I think, in my view, only a handful of people who really have a good grip on the complexity and depth of each of the issues in dispute. But the good news is, at least in principle, and of course the current reality makes this kind of feel fantastical, but I think that we can't ever let go of the hope that we can get back to a discourse about how to advance coexistence. The good news is there's still a lot of work to do, right? There's stuff we haven't done. There's things, dialogue we haven't had, and there's ideas that still are there to explore. So I think that's one important part of this. What was another one, Kalev? Give me one to throw out another one.
Everyone knows what the contours of an agreement look like, and
Yeah.
just get to the damn table.
Yeah, I think the that just get to the damn table is connected to also that if only thing that you said, right? Which is, you hear this phrase like all we need is political will, right? That to me sounds like saying all we need is everything, right? And this kind of language, I think, misunderstands the complexity and depth of this conflict. And I think maybe I'll just say something from many years in the negotiating room. Just one basic takeaway for me is that this is a dialogue between two traumatized people who basically need therapy on a national scale, right? And the idea that what's the core issue we need to do is discuss the issues in conflict and find some magic formula to compromise between them is a classic kind of foreign policy way of thinking about problems, but it's actually not the essence of the conflict, right? I found very often that, maybe I'll put it this way, I've been in a lot of very difficult conversations. I think all of us have been in difficult conversations. One of the things that characterizes difficult conversations is that the thing you're talking about is not actually the thing you're talking about. And the thing you're talking about is just a stand-in for some other conversation. So you think you're in the negotiating room talking about, I don't know, refugees or borders or any other issue. But what's actually happening very often is that conversation is a stand-in for a deeper conversation about each side's sense that they're in a zero-sum contest. Each side's need for the other to see their legitimacy. And every issue is it's the stage upon which you act out your differences, not the forum that you resolve your differences, right? Because what is shaping the conflict are not the issues in dispute. It is the identity stories of each society that understand their reality, understand their identity through the conflict. On the Palestinian side, I think that the sense of Palestinian victimhood is the oxygen very often of Palestinian identity. So much so that resolving the conflict involves reimagining Palestinian identity. And I think for a lot of Israeli Jews, it's hard to understand their own Israeli Jewish identity without the conflict. It doesn't always make sense. So there are these deep societal issues, and we make the mistake of thinking this is about choreography. Oh, we should have done, it should be bilateral. No, it should be multilateral. We should do refugees first. No, we should do borders first. We should do, those are the symptoms. They're not the cause. And, I think it might be annoying for this series for me to say this, but I'll just say that I have come kind of to the conclusion that all of my conclusions are temporary, so that I never get held to account, that we negotiators are self-important people, but we're not important people, right? We think we're important. We get invited to speak on and do things like that. But in fact, we're only relevant if we are reflecting the societies that sent us to the room. The work of creating the conditions for peacemaking is not a drafting exercise or an idea in creativity. Let me figure out this Rubik's Cube of these different core issues. The question is whether the societies themselves have created in their self-understanding the possibility of coexistence and of reconciliation as authentic to their identity. And if the societies have gone to a certain extent to that process, then the negotiators then the negotiators themselves can do something to help them. But if they haven't, you're just doodling on a piece of paper.
Does that mean then Tal, that in order to make progress, one needs to, on the bilateral level, be much more explicit about addressing those issues behind the issues? And necessarily want to use the kind of truth and reconciliation terminology, but does that mean that we got to get to the issues behind the issues in a much more explicit way?
Well, I mean, first, there's no university you go to get a degree in how to achieve a peace agreement, right? Nobody knows the answer to these questions, Jack, and there isn't like a magic key. So that means we do truth and reconciliation. That's a little bit also the if only stuff, right? Some people, you just know the formula. There isn't a formula. The challenge in my mind is, how do you generate dynamics that enable each society not to think that they're in a zero-sum contest, right? And that may be a truth and reconciliation process. It may not be. It may be something that the leaders do, but it may also be something that happens in in an educational forum, in a whole host of different ways. It may be an external event that you don't even control, that shapes it in one way or the other. I like to tell this story about one of the rounds of negotiation where a senior Palestinian representative, a friend of mine actually, presented an idea, and I thought it was a good idea. And the Americans were sitting there, and the Israelis and Palestinians were sitting there, and like some rookie negotiator who'd never done any negotiation, I said, "That's a great idea." And it took my Palestinian colleague about 2 minutes to retract the idea, because I had embarrassed him in front of his colleagues by being too enthusiastic about the idea. Had I wanted the idea to get traction, I should have been much more circumspect about it, right? Had we done this one-on-one, it would have been different. But in the theater of the negotiating room, because the mindset is a kind of zero-sum mindset, the prospect of agreement is itself a warning sign. And this has happened, I think I've seen this dynamic quite a bit. What does that tell you? It tells you that you are representing societies that, if the dominant narrative in those societies are, the other people don't recognize my legitimacy, the other people think we're in a zero-sum contest, then agreement is a sign of your negotiators not doing their job well enough, right? So it's a systemic problem. If agreement is evidence that your negotiators have failed, and the disagreement of the other side is evidence that your negotiators are representing your interests, because obviously if it's a zero-sum contest, they're going to be upset with what you're doing, then you have evidence, I think, of something deeply affecting the societies, which then influences the negotiating dynamic. How do we deal with that? In my view, is a much bigger question about how change happens in the stories people tell themselves about who they are. That's why I'm a big believer in the normalization process, for example, and its potential to help Israeli-Palestinian negotiations, because that has within it an engine for potentially legitimizing other stories, other ways of understanding ourselves, and for Palestinians as well.
Oh, I think this is your story. Don't you have a story that at a certain stage, just before an agreement, Palestinians come with a demand to add in a line or something, and then the Israelis, they go to you, you read through it, and you say that's absolutely fine, and then after you've agreed, they retract the demand?
Yeah, that was another case where our refusal to object to the change made the other side nervous that they had not seen something, and in the end they withdrew it because they thought they had made a mistake. I've been in the room when that's happened.
So you talked about normalization. So let's move on to the Abraham Accord. So you've said before, and it's a beautiful phrase, that the Abraham Accord signal the move from arguing over who the land belongs to towards the understanding that we all belong to the land. I would actually add that I think there's a kind of Hamas, Hezbollah, Iranian paradigm of Jews as white settler colonialists who armed struggle will send back home. And the Abraham Accords has this kind of understanding that both Jews and Arabs have a shared ancestor, Abraham, who, according to tradition, lives in the Holy Land. So it's actually this competing, it's a competing and much more constructive model of recognition. Can you tell us what's the process that leads to the Abraham Accords? Who are the main players? Kind of having spent many hours in room discussing and negotiating over Israeli-Palestinian issues, can you give us a taste of what it's like in the room when you're discussing the Abraham Accords?
Yeah, I mean, the dynamics were very different in the sense that, there was, in my view, kind of mutual enthusiasm to make progress with the Accords, and so the emotional scars and the trauma that the Israeli-Palestinian conflict invokes were just not there. I think the conditions that produced the Abraham Accords, there are multiple, right? Multiple conditions. It helped that we invested over 2 decades in these relationships quietly. I think it helped that there was a convergence of interests about threats and opportunities. I think the courage in particular of Mohammed bin Zayed of the UAE was very important. The investment of the Trump administration was critical. There are a whole set of things that produced the possibility to have the breakthrough. And the feeling when we were doing it was one of, a real partnership to push back in the way you were saying for those who have this kind of zero-sum version of the conflict. I would slightly amend the way you put it, Kalev, and just say that, I think there are two dominant narratives in the world and in the Middle East that we are fighting against. One is this idea that Israel is a kind of colonial presence, as you described. And that's a more kind of secular language around this, like we're the French in Algeria or something like that. But a second one is that Israel's existence is irreconcilable with Islam. It's a kind of theological dynamic. And the Abraham Accords push back on both of those, right? You have one of the core significance, in my view, at least the potential of the Abraham Accords, is that these are Muslim countries saying, we don't think opposition to Israel is inherent to our idea of Islam. We don't think Jews are infidels. And that creates momentum and legitimacy behind a way of understanding yourself as an authentic Muslim and hopefully as an authentic Palestinian, not in conflict. And I have to say, on the Israeli side, we are at a moment in Israeli society where Israel is also contesting its story of itself, where there are illiberal voices in Israel who are pushing their own version of a kind of zero-sum contest. And the Abraham Accords are also saying to our own society, no, we don't understand our Jewishness and Zionism as being about a zero-sum contest with the Palestinian people or with Islam. The Palestinian people also have a right to self-determination. They also belong here. They don't have a right to deny our self-determination, but our Jewish identity doesn't require a rejection of others' belongingness. So I think the Abraham Accords creates precisely that kind of framing that can compete with the Iranian Hezbollah, Hamas way of talking, that can create, that's what I was talking about, kind of therapy on a national scale, that can create the ways to understand your identity in different ways. And so the potential there is huge. And the importance of Saudi normalization in that context is really, I think, huge, because if the custodian of Mecca and Medina essentially articulates a view that Saudi Arabia is able to normalize relations with Israel. What is the word normalize? Just think about it for a second. Normalize means that there's nothing remarkable about Jews and Arabs living together in the Middle East. It's not a big deal. It's not a threat to our identity, right? And I know we get very excited about it. I certainly got very excited about it. But the point is for it to not be exciting, because it's not this kind of cosmic issue. Can Jews and Muslims be partners in the Middle East? No, obviously we're partners because we're both children of the Middle East. And it's a kind of pushing away of that narrative that says, we are somehow, our very existence is a threat to the other side.
Well, you described that process as well when you're in the Gulf. I think at a
Yes,
certain stage you realize that you're not emotional about being there, and then
that's
you get
right.
emotional about not being emotional.
That's right. You've heard me too much, Kalev, but yeah.
We did our homework,
Yeah.
Tal.
Yeah. So I did, I mean, I had the privilege of drafting much of the UAE-Israel agreement, obviously with UAE partners and American partners. And I think I with some help, I put in a key sentence there that said, recognizing that the Jewish and Arab peoples are descendants of a common ancestor, Abraham, and in that spirit committed to fostering a Middle East based on mutual understanding and respect between peoples of all different faiths, ethnicities, and nationalities. And I wasn't sure that that language would be accepted by the Emiratis, because even though it sounds like motherhood and apple pie, we really have never had the kind of articulation of this sense of a common ancestry, a common sense of belonging. And that was language that the Emiratis accepted, which I think is the potential in that is huge, because it speaks in my mind to the potential for a Judeo-Muslim civilizational consciousness or awareness. I'm a much more, even though I grew up in Australia, I'm much more Middle Eastern in the way that I think about this conflict, right? I try not to think about peacemaking in Western secular liberal terms, because that's not the constituents we are representing by and large. And we need to translate it into the language of the Middle East. And just to be clear, that the problem some of the time is when you're in the negotiating room and you have a Western mindset, you think what you're doing is kind of splitting the difference, right? You think what you're doing is, oh, what's your position? What's my position? Let's kind of figure out some kind of creative thing on the piece of paper that will resolve this agreement. That's not the essence of what we're doing here. The essence of what we're doing is to try to create a sense of consciousness and identity that resonates for people as true to who they are as Middle Easterners, as Jews and Muslims who are children of the Middle East. It's not the purchase of a car in a used car lot.
Thanks, Tal. I just want to stay with the Abraham Accords for a moment, based on what you've just said, and ask whether the extent, in your view, that those shifts in consciousness that the Accords represented are reflective of kind of public shifts, as well as in the respective countries, as well as kind of elite shifts. So, and then based on that, what it is that you think caused those developments, those shifts in consciousness? In other words, why at this particular epoch did those societies reach that stage of consciousness shift?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, these are issues that are in flux. They are contested. They exist within the societies, and sometimes one has more force than the other, right? And for me, it's such a fascinating and difficult to decipher dynamic about how people's stories of themselves change over time, right? If you asked an Israeli Jew what the story of Israel was in the 1990s, they would tell a very different story, right, to what they might say today. And same is true of the 50s and so on. Now, I'm not enough of an expert in each country in the Middle East to tell you how the story of themselves shifted, but I try as a negotiator to really understand as best I can the way each people we're negotiating with understands themselves, right? And when you think about the way the Emiratis understand themselves, or the Moroccans understand themselves, part of the challenge here is to kind of craft what you're doing in a language that resonates at least with part of that society, right? To create more momentum. There will be pushback. It's a slow process and so on. I think, for example, the Emiratis are people who are genuinely committed to a version of Islam that is tolerating of difference, right? I use that word carefully. I wish it was celebrating of difference, but I think that's a little too far. But certainly tolerating of difference, allergic to violence, committed to kind of broad prosperity and stability. Those are all things that are the legacy of the Emiratis rulers, but also I think quite ingrained in Emirati society, right? That doesn't mean that there isn't a stigma around Israel and there isn't concern about the conflict, but there are things to work with there, right? And obviously, in our own society, there are a huge battle within Israeli Jewish society about the soul of this country, in which direction it's moving, and what are the ways in which to understand our identity. And the Abraham Accords kind of, I think, tried to tap into that and create momentum. October 7th, in that sense, was a kind of resurgence of this zero-sum sense. We're on our own. The only option here is for one side to win or the other side to win. And in that sense, the war we're in now is a big part of it is about confronting the capabilities of our enemies, but no less important is taking on the appeal of the stories that they tell, right? And the normalization process, the importance of it is that it operates in the realm of ideas. It offers a different way to imagine a Middle East, which I think most of the people in the Middle East want.
Thanks, Tal. That leads us into where we're going to go next, which is the present moment and Israeli-Palestinian relations. You've spoken in the past about there being three typical responses among people when the track of Israeli-Palestinian peace is not progressing, which I think we can safely say is the case in the present moment. You've spoken about despair, blame, and fantasy, but you've also insisted that we have in our need to believe in what you call the permanent possibility of the presently unimaginable. With those two things in mind, I mean, where are we at the moment, and what are some useful and productive ways we might approach a better future?
I mean, so maybe just to start, I think that blame move, which, I mean, each of those has their place, the blame, the despair, the fantasy, right? You want to get out of it. I go back first to this idea that peace is something you have more of or less of, right? And the more we move away from a kind of utopian version of peace, the more we can imagine ourselves in practical terms. What would it take for us to create a more positive dynamic? Now, part of that, in my view, I often think about it in these terms. In our tradition, it says, Bakesh Shalom Veradfehu, seek peace and pursue it. It doesn't say seek peace and achieve it, right? And I think it's interesting that it doesn't say achieve it. And that's probably because it isn't in your hands to achieve it, right? There are too many variables you don't control. And I really have developed this allergy to people who think they know the answer to how we achieve it, right? But pursuing it, I think, is actually something that can be an action plan. Part of pursuing it, frankly, is targeting its enemies. And I think of this current war as really being about denying the ability of the enemies of peace to dictate the future of the Middle East. The fact that Iran, Hezbollah, and Hamas have less capability to project their power and their agenda across the Middle East is part of the pursuit of peace. But so is articulating an aspiration for where we want to go. I'm an advocate for articulating aspirations that you don't know how to achieve. The idea that you can't win the lottery if you don't buy a ticket. That kind of notion that we can't let this war shrink our capacity to imagine the kind of future we want to reach. So yes, there's huge questions. How do we achieve a Palestinian entity that isn't going to threaten Israel, that isn't going to be corrupt? These are huge questions, right? How do we ensure that both peoples move to a place where they see each other in a different way? But I think the goal of articulating an aspiration is really important. I think that doubling down on the normalization process, asking ourselves hard questions and being willing to pay a certain price in order to enable that normalization process to continue is critical, because it, as we talked about before, creates that alternative set of narratives. And I also think being counterintuitive helps a lot. There are such fixed narratives in each side about the kind of reality we live in. And when we act in counterintuitive ways, I think it's important to show much more compassion for Palestinian suffering in Gaza, for example. It's hard to do in war, but I think it's necessary and moral to do so. I think you try to encourage things that surprise people to begin to kind of shake their consciousness. Now, I don't want to be naive about it and say, you know, these are the criteria for which will achieve something. I don't know. And there are genuinely irreconcilable forces that need to be confronted. But I think we are a healthier society and a better society. And by not discounting the possibility that we can emerge from this horrible war and the trauma of this war in a reality where the enemies of peace, not only their capabilities, but the way they imagine the reality is no longer compelling for many, many people. And we create an energy and momentum behind a different way of seeing things. And I just think it would be devastating if we didn't have this constant effort to make things better as part of our DNA.
Just to clarify, our DNA is who's the our?
Yeah, that's a good point. First of all, I think it's Israeli policy should, on the one hand, be focused on survival and defeating our enemies, but it can never abandon a language of aspiration and hope as to where we're trying to go. You know, you think about it, compare 1948 to this moment, right? We talk about this war as the war of Tkuma, the kind of the second independence war in some respect. But in 1948, you know, the Jewish people had just gone through the worst genocide in human history. There were 6 Arab states about to invade us. Nobody knew if Israel would survive. There was a civil war raging within Israel itself, and we were still capable of marking out an aspiration as to where we wanted to go in the Declaration of Independence, right? The Arab states said, we're coming to wipe the Jews off the face of the earth. And we said, we stretch our hand out in peace. Now, in today's language, that would be thought of as naive, right? And kind of foolish. But what was happening there was, in my view, critical. It's not naivety to say that you need to articulate an aspiration in order to be able to rally and have an identity story that isn't just about survival. I would like to extend the hour. That's a very good point, Kalev. It can't be just us. We need to look for partners. I believe there are partners for that vision. Certainly in the region and in parts of the world, there are also partners who are strong opponents to that vision. And this isn't an action plan that I can say in 5 years we'll achieve this or that. It's a pursuit. It's a direction of movement that I think is not less important than being absolutely vigilant and resilient in our self-defense in military terms.
So the reason I asked is because it's good, Tal. Each time you've basically given us a segue into the next part of our thing. So there's an international conference planned for mid-June. It's organised by French President Macron and Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman. According to reports, France is hoping that several states will take the opportunity to unilaterally recognise a Palestinian state. Just kind of interested in your general thoughts about, I guess not statehood, but a European unilateral recognition of Palestinian statehood at this time.
I mean, to be honest, I'm kind of in the phase of recovering from all this stuff. I'm doing a little bit different things in the world of education at the Hartman Institute now, so I'm not up to speed in what the objectives of this conference are and so on. I myself have never been a huge fan of these diplomatic conferences. What matters to me is where the parties themselves are able to go, and perhaps diplomatic support for that. A conference that doesn't involve, you know, both Israeli and Palestinian buy-in in a significant way, I'm skeptical, let's say, about how effective it can be. I also think that there is this tendency sometimes, and I'm not saying this specifically about this conference because I don't know the details, but the tendency in the international community is often to focus on how do we look good rather than how do we do good, right? How do we create the pyrotechnics of looking like we're investing in peace, not the actual question about what it would take to move an Israeli society, for example, that's traumatized in a different direction, and to help Palestinians move away from this kind of rejectionist language. And for me, this idea of a unilateral declaration of statehood, it's a symbolic act, but the message sent by it is really, in my view, hugely problematic. If it's framed in that way, the way it will be taken by the Israeli Jewish public is essentially that of rewarding Hamas for October 7th, of essentially saying the reason why we are in the place we are in is not because there are, terrorist organizations supported by Iran who are committed to the obliteration of Israel. It's because of the lack of a diplomatic breakthrough. And somehow unilateral recognition is going to encourage that breakthrough. It just seems to me really problematic. I noticed how, it's just a very clear indicator. Hamas's celebration of any act towards unilateral statehood, I think there was a couple of states who moved in that way, I can't even remember now, a little while ago, is a big indicator of how that move plays. The question that needs to be asked is, how do you help each society come to terms with each other, embrace a vision of their identity that doesn't involve denying the belongingness and right to self-determination of the other? I think unilateral recognition is a recipe for doing the opposite, right? It tells the Palestinians we don't have expectations of you. What we have, you don't have responsibilities, you have rights. And it tells Israelis, you don't have rights, you have responsibilities. And in that way, it kind of entrenches what I think are negative dynamics in each side. Both sides have rights and responsibilities, and the role of the international community is to kind of push those parties together, not choose sides, and not create this idea that this is a kind of victim-villain story. And then it's like a comic strip narrative. There's a victim, there's a villain, and we need to figure out who's who and then side with whatever side. That's not a recipe for peacemaking. That's a recipe for perpetuating the conflict.
I just want to stay with that for a minute, Tal, and push back on it ever so slightly, because I've written in favor of unilateral recognition. You spoke earlier about the need to fight not only literally the enemies of a peaceful vision, but also to fight their appeal. And my argument is that a valuable commodity in fighting that appeal has to be hope and optimism, and that unilateral recognition could, if done correctly, could be a means of conveying to the Palestinian people that there is a hopeful future along a diplomatic track. So first, I'm first of all interested in your reaction to that, but also more broadly, picking up off you saying we need to fight the appeal of these people on both sides. What we might call both rejectionist parties, because while Hamasism clearly is opposed to the kind of vision that you hold and outline, there are also, as you mentioned earlier on, forces in Israeli society, rather powerful forces in Israeli society at the moment who are opposed as well. So first of all, I'm interested in your response to my remarks about unilateral recognition, but also do opposing those forces look different in each case, Israeli and Palestinian, or is there some kind of unifying similarity that opposing those forces would have in both instances?
I'll deal with the first question. The second question is really hard. So I think that, when I think about the challenge of this conflict, it is on the Palestinian side, it is how to cultivate an authentic form of Palestinian identity that can come to terms with Jewish self-determination. And on the Israeli side, it is about how to come to terms with an Israeli Jewish identity, how to cultivate an Israeli Jewish identity that comes to terms with Palestinian belongingness and self-determination. Unilateral recognition is not a recipe for doing that, because what it says is we want to embolden Palestinian statehood without requiring of the Palestinians to come to terms with the fact that another people belong here. And I think that that empowers a narrative that pushes us away from that. And I would feel that way also on the other side. Like I think at the end of the day, you know, actions produce reactions, right? Unilateral recognition, which the Israeli Jewish public will see as essentially choosing one side over the other, will produce an Israeli Jewish reaction that says, if you don't see me, then I won't see you, right? And where the peacemaking is about seeing. It's about seeing the other, right? So that's why I think about that. Your second question, Jack, if I understood it, is really, to speak about the kind of opponents of this vision and whether confronting them or dealing with them is different in each society. I think that's very interesting challenge. And it's not often that I'm asked a question that I say I just need to think about before I answer. So I'm not going to answer it because I think it needs serious reflection. I'm generally my intuition is not to kind of try to defeat opponents. It's rather to create dynamics that diminish their appeal, that marginalize them, but not in some grand kind of triumph. Because my instinct most of the time is that when you play a zero-sum game, even when you win, you sow the seeds of your subsequent defeat, because your triumph is the rallying cry for others to retaliate. And I think a lot of Israeli politics in particular, but around the world, is this oscillating pendulum. One side comes into power and tries to undo what the other side did. And the process of peacemaking, if it's successful, is by creating a dynamic in which most of the elements within a society, even those who are opposed, somehow are able to integrate that approach into their story. You will always have margins who oppose it, but I may be wrong, but my instinct isn't to have this kind of grand victory strategy over the opponents of this. I'm drawn to the definition of diplomacy, which says diplomacy is the art of letting other people get your way, right? And that version of it says, well, okay, we have within Israeli society an identity story of Jews that makes reconciliation with the Palestinian people very difficult. What in that tradition may make it more possible to acquiesce or reconcile? And I think there is within that tradition ways to empower that view. In Palestinian society, the challenge is much greater in my view. I think it would be probably presumptuous of me to suggest what to do, because I'm no expert in the internal workings of Palestinian society, though I have Palestinian friends.